like to share a little bit with you about spirituality, and I'm going to draw from a Gnostic writing, and this comes from the second treatise of the great Seth. And it reads, "It is I who am in you, and you are in me, just as the Father is in you in innocence. And the God within is more present when we are babes and are in awe of the world." And I feel that when he's referring to being in awe of the world, it's when you make these tiny discoveries. And I made one yesterday while I was reading about quantum consciousness. It was something written by DeBasey. And the way they were explaining things is that, yes, you've heard the term that this is a light universe, despite when we look up into the sky and we see darkness and stars. But they presented an idea that the entanglement of quantum or quantum information and space and time, it creates what they call an interference pattern, which is used in holograms. And that this type of interference pattern is what gives substance to everything that is around us, allowing us to experience a life like this. And I was so excited by it. I was awestruck. In fact, I couldn't wait to look into the next portion of the book of knowledge to see how I could use this, because everything made sense all of a sudden. And I believe that is the awe, or what is meant by becoming as a child once again, to experience heaven or spirit or the divine, however you choose to describe it. That's my impression that I would like to share with you. Would anyone like to add their thoughts to that as well?
That's a great and beautiful description, Reverend Philip, of that oneness. I think is a term often used. You touched on what Jesus said, that when you see me, you see the Father. I'm in the Father's in me. You see me, you see the Father. And it was in that place that he did the things that we call miracles, in that place of connection. And that is a beautiful happening when it happens, and good description of it. And I like the way you tied it in with, or it happened for you when you were reading about quantum energy, and because it all connects. It's all ways of describing the same truth. And thank you for sharing that. Great experience.
You're welcome. Would anyone else like to make a comment?
That was very nice, Reverend Philip. Yeah, that honest, that quantum, just such a very small change in your view opens up such a large window, and that happens to us from time to time, and it is a blessing. And Jesus did say that, he's in us and we're in the Father, or he's in the Father, we're in the Father. I think Thomas put it very well, and I think that you did very, very well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that. And I will say thank you for allowing me to share that, and thank you, Reverend Bacon and Reverend Thomas, for sharing your thoughts. And I'd like to continue with our exploration of J.J. Hurtak's Book of Knowledge, The Keys of Enoch. And we are continuing with the fifth key. And this is what he has written for us. The key to our astrophysical time zones is the 3-in-1 alignment of consciousness forces in the Great Pyramid, with the 12s and 1 energies of time warp pyramids centered and controlled by the many and 1 throne energies of Orion and the Pleiades. Now, we talked about the alignment of consciousness forces and the Great Pyramid. That's very suggestive. And we talked about the light pyramids in the 4th key. And we entertained the idea that we are these light pyramids, being vessels of information. And here, the Great Pyramid may be a reference to the Great Pyramid of Giza, while consciousness is awareness. It's about, in the previous lesson, we talked about the two of them aligning with each other. And we talked about the idea of consciousness program being the routines or habits that we fall into. And we also discussed the potential of aligning the body with mind in such a way as to alter our experience of life. Now, I just want to remind you that all of this is geared towards the evolution of self. And self includes the body. So, in this verse, we're going to look at Enoch explained that when humankind opens the pyramid Sphinx and uses the consciousness meridians to connect the 12 energy vortices of the world to the pyramid Sphinx, they will have reached a threshold where the energy vehicles can return and take humankind to the next evolutionary station. We're going to focus on the Sphinx. And he's talking about this idea, and we've discussed this before, but he's talking about the idea of making the inside the outside and the outside the inside. In other words, it's bringing the two realities, because we all have our own inner reality. And that inner reality is the truer reality because, well, it's all about us. And we control that reality. And then we have the outer reality, which is, as it says, the common reality, I believe, is what Charles Tart described it as. And that's the reality where we are all in agreement, that we are all sitting in a chair, or perhaps a couch or a love seat. But that's what the outer reality is about. And our next aspiration is to join this with the Sphinx of Giza. And the mystery schools tell us precious little about the Sphinx. So before we proceed, I would like to show you some images of the Sphinx so you can picture this as we work through some of its definitions. And as you can see, the Sphinx is a blending of two principles here. These are different ones that are in existence now. This is an illustration or an image of the Greeks. It was the Greeks who took the idea of the Sphinx and added wings to it. But this is our focus. This is the Sphinx of Giza, and it has the different parts to it. So as we explore the Sphinx, our first impression could be one of confusion because the upper part is a human body, while the lower part, we see it as a lion, but it is a male lion. And it represents the two principles, the two active principles. Well, I shouldn't have said active. The two principles of creation, and that is being receptive and active. And receptive is when you put yourself into a state, like when we meditated earlier, you put yourselves into a state to receive from the divine, to receive from those souls that may have come to mind, the names that may have come to mind. That's what that is about. And the active part, that is what influences the receptive. When we are receptive, we are allowing ourselves to be acted upon. Yin and yang are it's a symbol that we're familiar with. They're two labels we are familiar with. And one means initiation, and the other is completion. And that is what's happening, because it's within nature we have growth and decay, and it always appears to be simultaneously. Now, science has a representation of this because we refer to everything as being frequencies or vibrations, and it's oscillations. It's when energy moves from one point to another point, and then it rests momentarily before returning. So we've got this back and forth motion, and it's this back and forth motion that gives us vibration. And it's vibrations that give us frequencies. And this is what many of our teachers have referred to. Because they talk about, well, here's something from one of the Gnostic writings that Jesus said. If they ask you, what is the sign of your Father in you? Say to them, it is movement and repose. This is what it's referring to. Movement and repose. There is another that I read in Sogyal Rinpoche's Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And he says that the point when you meditate, the point you want to be at is in between thoughts. And our breathing is another representation of this vibration, of this oscillation, of this activity of active and receptive. Because we breathe in, we inhale, and we pause momentarily. And then we exhale, and we pause momentarily. We're not aware of that pause because we're too busy breathing. But when we exercise, especially, I ride my bike a lot of times early in the mornings, and I get it going. And I'm breathing in, and I got to pause before I can release that air to blow it back out again. That's the reference here. And this is a very basic interpretation of the Sphinx. Are there any thoughts that you might have?
Well, it's an interesting concept. I think I got a little too caught up in the Sphinx mythology, being the little Egyptologist that I must have been in a previous lifetime.
We'll get into that.
that I think I might have maybe missed the meaning
No, I'm sure you didn't. These things have a tendency to repeat themselves. Remember the Hermetic principle of rhythm. It's all about cycles, meaning it repeats itself.
I think you said something in the beginning about the energy had to come through the Sphinx before it goes to the pyramids, something to that effect, or was it the opposite?
Well, we're getting there. You're on the right
Okay.
track. You're
All
on the
right.
right track. All of
All
you
right.
are ahead of me. I must be behind.
I don't know that much about all of that, about the whole. I mean, I know of it, but I don't know the deeper meanings. I'm sure it's very spiritual. I know it is. I don't think most people really have any idea how very spiritual it was or is still to this day. The fact that they still exist is wonderful. But I'm going to keep listening because I'm not. I want to hear more about what it is. Yeah.
Think of it like this. One portion of the Sphinx represents the inside,
Oh, okay.
and another portion of the Sphinx represents the outside.
Mhm. It seems to me also like it's the combination of the male and female energy, and they're you have a being or a creature or whatever you want to call it that is like a combination of all in one kind of that. I mean, that when you looked at the different pictures, yeah, it's really interesting.
You got it.
Okay.
I might just cut this short. Everybody's ahead of me. Britta, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us?
I actually resonated with the masculine feminine energies is what I saw from it, bringing the two together as part of creation. And those are the two parts that come together to create and work, in co-creating with God. And so that's how I connected it.
Good. So, as we continue with this, let me make sure I didn't lose I lost my thoughts again. I have to make notes for myself to pause. But I'm sure you noticed, and a lot of people, some of you have mentioned this, that the upper portion is human. And this is important because some of the early teachings suggest that the purpose of the upper portion being human is to encourage us to transcend our limitations. And this is a common theme within the Book of Knowledge, is to move beyond those limitations. The idea is to move beyond what we are familiar with. And that's what he's always talking about. And I've just had the privilege to read more of it. But as we continue with this, there are also, if you notice, a lot of the teachings, they always represent the divine in what form? A human form. Ever wonder about that? I mean, in Genesis, it tells us we are created in the image of God, suggesting that this is God's form. It reinforces the idea of Jesus teaching us, and I believe in the reading that I had given earlier of God being within us and us being of God. It reinforces that, making us, one or a unification. There's a lot of ways that you can put this, but it's something that is repeated over and over, including in the Bible. There are at least two places. One's in Psalm 82, and the other is with Jesus, where it says that we are God's. And the idea with that is that we have a lot of potential within us. And then there is the lower portion of the Sphinx, which is that of a lion. Now, they do have other versions that have different aspects from different animals, but the lion, and Beth will resonate this as she was talking about her little Egyptologist within her. For the Egyptians, the lion was a representation of the sun, for the same reason that Leo is a representation of the sun. It's the mane of the male lion. That's why the lower half is the male lion, because it has that mane, and it represents the sun. And typically, the sun represents the intellect. But in this case, it's the female portion that is the higher portion. But the idea with the lion is that it also represents the male principle or the active principle. So we come back to this idea of receptive and active. Now, if we were to look at it straightforward, we could say the active is the main portion, what we should be focused on. Or we could look at it and say, well, it's being receptive that we should be focused on. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and I'm going to ask for your thoughts on some of this.
Well, it's a wonderful discussion, and you've touched on many important points that bring up a lot of pondering. One of the things that came to me when you were talking about our divine aspect, talking about it from Genesis and that. The metaphor that has made a picture for me to imagine that is the cycle of moisture, and that moisture or water evaporates from the ocean, and falls in the mountains, and the individual drops, fall off the leaves and on the ground and form together into a little creek, and they form into a stream, and eventually they find their way back to the ocean. And if you were to take a drop of ocean water and analyze it, you would find all of the minerals, everything that is in the ocean can be measured and represented in a drop of ocean water. Yet the drop of ocean water is not a terribly powerful thing until it unites with the other drops in the ocean. And to me, that has always resonated and allows me to have some glimpse of the role that we play in this great creation. We are not the creator, but we have the potential of the creator. And depending on our level of unification and uniting in any given moment, depends on how much influence we have over the reality around us. And sometimes those moments look like it did when Jesus walked the earth and did things that we call miracles. So anyway, you brought all of that wonderfully back to mind, and I thank you for allowing me to share that.
Thank you. You're welcome. You talked about moisture, and this is something that's explored in alchemy. But the idea with that I liked is we have the ground, and the ground is typically dry. And then we have the water, which is, well, obviously wet. And when the water lands on the ground becomes moist. But the question here is, which is active and which is receptive? And if we invoke the Hermetic principle of polarization, then there is always moisture in the dirt, and there is always dirt in the water. It's when they become complementary that we get moist earth or mud. So thank you for that.
Or
And
fertile ground.
exactly, fertile
Because
ground.
Those two things together make something new happen that couldn't happen separately.
And that's the underlying idea with a lot of the mystery teachings, including this. And Rachel, would you like to offer some thoughts?
Well, I came in the middle of the conversation. However, I find it interesting that the Sphinx is also a fusion of animal and human. And, I guess I am curious whether the Egyptians were kind of fusing animal nature into the equation, or, some base aspect of our humanity. Not sure, but that's interesting.
Well, to answer that, some believe that the Egyptians saw the Sphinx as representing the strength of intelligence and being, which is why it is considered to be an androgynous representation, meaning a blending. And the whole idea here is to get to what is called the primal being, the first creation that brings forth these two principles, a female and the male. Because when we get to this primal being, or this primal aspect of us, which is for many of us the journey of exploring spirituality, is that we find that within us, we are both receptive and active. We are both male and female. It's the energetic representations that we have to focus on, because a lot of us get caught up in this gender identification of male and female. And I could point to a lot of a lot of the societal controversy that has taken place recently with that. But it's all about those principles, those energetic principles. And that's what the Sphinx represents, is a blending. Because only through this blending can the consciousness expand, meaning that mind needs the body, or the female needs the male, and the male needs the female. The body needs the mind. Does that make sense for you?
No further thoughts. Good talk.
Oh, well, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And Sharon, any last thoughts or questions?
Well, I think we just touched on this just a tiny little bit here, it seems like.
Yes,
So
we did.
there's a lot more ahead of that, I'm sure, about how is this the entryway into, so to speak, into the pyramid part of the whole story. We're just at the beginning, I think. So that would be curious to know where that moves on to next. Yeah, but it's really interesting. And I always thought the Egyptians were they had a real reverence for felines, for cats of any kind. And I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, people who love cats could probably go on and on and on about why. They're for all of the mystery of cats. So it would be that alone would be a whole hour right there. So I'm sure, but I don't know. They obviously had a reason for why they chose this, and I bet there's more to it even than we even see today. So a lot more.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about these early religions, they were all centered on nature. So you could say that the idea of the Sphinx could be a representation of blending nature with humankind.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because on the surface, that's what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, it can go much deeper than that. As we began with the principles of nature, the active and the receptive. And it always comes back to those two principles, active and receptive. In all of those ancient writings and teachings, it always comes back to those and bringing the two together. But before you can bring the two together, you have to understand what each of them represent. And therein lies the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Britta, do you have any last thoughts you would like to add?
I appreciate this conversation. It's very thought-provoking. It's enlightening and inspiring for me. I loved what everyone shared in these different aspects of understanding. And it made me think from the place of within us, we are whole, but we are also part of the whole. And and that's kind of what I see in how we impact one another in our unity, and to be aware of that, and the impact of that. So that's kind of what I saw with it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Very good. Thank you for adding your thoughts. And thank you for joining us. And Beth, what are your last thoughts?
I don't have any.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
kind of Sharon kind of spoke them. So, it is a deep trip.
The entire book is deep. I warned all of you before we embarked upon this exploration. That's why we do it in little bitty pieces at a time. So, and Reverend Thomas, any thoughts you'd like to share?
Just to respond to Sharon's verbal question there about cats. I did see a program where there was a DNA study trying to find the domestication point of cats, and it was a long, drawn-out research project that led them to a particular village in Egypt, and the other thing that came out of that was interesting was that they believed that cats were the only species that was not domesticated by men, but chose to not necessarily be domesticated, but chose to cohabitate with men, and that it was cats that solved the problem of them losing half or more of their stored grain because of rats and mice and vermin. And so they may well be honored because, boy, we need the cats or we're going to starve. I mean, it may come down to something as simple as that. Often we tend to go into something more esoteric and there's something spiritual about it. but the practicalities of life is without grain, everybody's hungry. And cats are important, so they kind of brought that, applied some religious meaning to that, so that people would honor them. So anyway, that's what I have to share. Great discussion, very deep, very thought provoking. Keys of Enoch is full of that, and and it gets even more bizarre. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. And you made a good point with the practicality. All these esoteric lessons that we have, they all began as very practical, but they grew from observation. And that's what makes religion what it is through observation. You could say that religion is a type of science, because to benefit properly from it, you have to observe, and then you have to experiment. Something to keep in mind. And I'd like to close with this. Pythagoras taught us that ultimately humankind will evolve into a state of being that exists simultaneously in both realms seamlessly. The body shall not always strive against the soul, as we are taught. For the soul, the body is home. And when perfected, when the home is perfected, it becomes the temple. And I want to thank all of you for allowing me to share this with you.